Imagine yourself standing on an open plain 1,000 years ago. The sun is sinking behind the distant hills, dragging the last warmth of the day down with it. You are barefoot. The earth is cooling fast beneath your soles, and your only possessions are a sharpened stone, a smoldering branch, and the skins on your back. There are no walls. There are no locks. And the thing you fear most in the world is about to arrive. Not an animal, not a storm, just the darkness. Because for our ancestors, the night wasn't a time of rest. It was a horror movie, one they lived through every single evening. And if they made one mistake, they didn't get a sequel. This is the story of how they survived it. The story of the most terrifying 8 hours in human history, and the skills, the bonds, and the sheer desperate intelligence that kept our bloodline breathing until the sun came up again. This is the night our ancestors faced. Step into it with me. To understand why the night was so horrifying, you first have to understand what our ancestors were. They were not the top of the food chain. They were not apex predators. They were, for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, prey. And prey animals have a universal rule. When the light dies, the killers wake up. The human eye, remarkable as it is built for daylight. Our depth perception, our color vision, our ability to spot a flicker of movement in the grass, all of it collapses in low light. Meanwhile, the things that hunted us, the saber-toothed cats, the giant hyenas, the leopards that specialized in dragging hominins from trees, saw the darkness as if it were noon. They owned the night. To step out of the circle of daylight was to enter their world without an invitation. That was the first law our ancestors learned. When the sun goes down, you do not want to be alone, and you do not want to be in the open. So the horror movie began not at midnight, but at dusk. Every single evening played out the same tense ritual. You had perhaps 15 minutes of useful twilight. If you were part of a foraging group, you didn't casually walk back to camp. You hurried. You checked the sky. You listened for the shift in bird calls that signaled something large was moving. Your heart rate climbed not because you were thinking about it, but because your body remembered what happened to those who didn't make it back. Dusk was the opening title sequence of the nightmare, and everyone knew the genre, survival. And that's where the first act of this nightly horror movie actually reveals its genius. Because ancient humans didn't just stumble through the dark in panic. They built a defense system so effective that it became the foundation of everything we now call home. And it started with the single most important discovery in human history, the deliberate control of fire. We tend to think of fire as a tool for cooking and warmth, and it was. But its original power was far more primal. Fire was the first wall. It was the first guard dog. It was a portable piece of the sun, stolen from nature and held in a circle of stones. When your people gathered around that dancing orange light, the darkness didn't disappear, but was pushed back. The eyes that glowed just beyond the reach of the flames still watched you, but they did not attack. Because every predator that had ever evolved knew one thing. Fire is pain. Fire is uncontrollable. Fire is death. And so the campfire became the center of the entire human universe. The safe zone. But the fire alone was not enough. A flame could die. A branch could burn out. And the predators were patient. They watched the circle of light as if they were studying the flickers for weakness. This is where the horror movie deepened. Imagine you are sitting cross-legged by that fire, and you feel the weight of exhaustion from a day of hunting and gathering. Your eyes are heavy. The warmth is hypnotic. You know, absolutely know, that if you fall asleep, the fire might dwindle. And if the fire dwindles, the darkness will creep closer. And in that darkness, they are waiting. The rustle you heard 5 minutes ago wasn't the wind. The brief flash of eyeshine at the edge of the light wasn't imagination. So you must stay awake. But you cannot stay awake forever. This was the impossible equation of the Stone Age night. Sleep was essential, but sleep was a death sentence if nobody guarded the flame. The solution our ancestors found was so profound that it literally rewired the human species. They invented the role of the sentinel. Not a formal job, but a biological and social adaptation. Someone, or several someones, would remain alert while others slept. This is where the physiology of fear carved itself into our DNA. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with a jolt of adrenaline, heart pounding, utterly certain that you heard something? That's not a glitch. That's a survival mechanism passed down from countless nights of terror. Your ancestors were the ones who woke up. The ones who didn't stir in time were removed from the gene pool. So modern insomnia, that sense of hyper-awareness at 3 a.m., is actually the echo of the sentinel mind, the part of you that still knows the night was once a horror movie. And it saved us. But the sentinel system had a deeply beautiful side effect, and it's something we don't appreciate enough. To keep the sentinels awake and to keep the terror at bay, the group talked. They murmured. They shared gestures. And out of that necessity, something extraordinary was born. The first stories. The horror movie our ancestors were living gave birth to the very first storytelling. Around that tiny island of light, voices would rise and fall. Someone would recount the hunt. Someone would mimic the growl of the lion they heard at dusk. Someone would tell of a dream. And in the darkness beyond, the predators heard not just fire, but a strange, unified sound they did not understand. The sound of a species binding itself together with words. The sound of fear being transformed into culture. That was the first counterattack. The night could send its horrors, but humanity sent back imagination. And yet, even with fire and sentinels and stories, the terror of the night was far from over. Because the horror movie had a feature that modern humans have almost entirely forgotten. The landscape itself became a monster. We have a tendency to project our modern sense of night onto the past. We think of a moonlit night as romantic or at least navigable. But for our ancestors, the world outside the firelight was not just dark. It was actively disorienting. There were no landmarks you could see, no paths illuminated. The stars were a cold, distant map that only a few began to read. If you had to step away from the fire to relieve yourself or fetch fuel, you entered a realm of absolute sensory deprivation except for the things you most feared. And your own mind filled the void. A branch cracked, and your brain drew a stalking cat. The wind shifted, and you smelled your own panic. Every shadow had teeth. This is where the psychological horror really took root. Anthropologists believe that the universal human experience of night terrors, hypnagogic hallucinations, and the feeling of a presence in the dark stems directly from this prehistoric pressure cooker. When you were drifting off to sleep beside the fire, your brain couldn't fully shut down the threat detection systems. So you dreamed of being chased. You dreamed of being pinned. You dreamed of falling into pits of blackness. These weren't just random nightmares. They were rehearsals, training scenarios. The brain's way of keeping you alive by forcing you to experience the worst possible outcomes in a safe, simulated environment while the sentinel kept watch. The very nightmares that make you wake up gasping today are the legacy of a survival strategy that worked. The night was a horror movie that played inside your head as well as outside it. And the most terrifying part of all, the real-life monsters were patient. They didn't just flee from the fire. They learned its rhythm. A pack of giant hyenas, for instance, would circle a camp for hours, not attacking, just waiting. Waiting for the fuel to run low. Waiting for one person to walk just far enough to gather wood. Waiting for the sentinel to blink for 1 second too long. The fossil record tells us this through puncture marks on hominin skulls perfectly matching the jaws of leopards, through bones found in ancient hyena dens, through footprints in volcanic ash that show a predator stalking a family at night. There is one haunting set of tracks from Tanzania, preserved for over 3 million years. They show a group of early hominins walking together, and then, at the edge of the path, the tracks of a large cat cross theirs. The cat's tracks then fall in line directly behind the last individual. A small individual. A child. The tracks end. The story tells itself. And it tells us that the night's horror movie was not a metaphor. It was a visceral, recurring event that claimed the smallest, the slowest, the one who lingered at the back of the group just a second too long. So how did ancient humans fight back against an enemy they could not see, could not outrun in the dark, and could not outthink in an ambush? They did something utterly brilliant. They turned the darkness against itself by becoming invisible. not through camouflage, but through sound. Our ancestors developed an incredible ability to move through the night in absolute silence. They learned to step on the balls of their feet, to avoid dry twigs, to communicate through subtle clicks and hand signals that made no echo. They became ghosts, and if they had to make a sound, they made it together in a chorus that confused the predator's audio targeting. You've probably experienced a version of this if you've ever been in a forest at night and found yourself whispering instinctively. That's not cultural conditioning. That's an ancient survival behavior. The night taught us that silence is a weapon. But the most powerful weapon of all was something that emerged almost accidentally from the terror. Trust. The intensity of the night bonded the group in a way that daylight never could. During the day, you could be an individual. You could walk ahead of the group, forage alone for a while, have small arguments. But when the sun set, the horror movie demanded a unity that overrode every petty human conflict. You could not survive the night if you were angry at the person next to you. You could not guard the fire if you were not willing to die for the ones sleeping beside you. So the night forged a pact that was signed in fear and sealed in the blood of those who had already fallen. And this pact gave birth to one of the most profound human emotions, solidarity. Not just friendship, but the deep, marrow-level knowledge that your life depends on someone else, and theirs on you. The night stripped away pretense and left only mutual obligation. That's why when we sit around a fire today, even at a campsite, we feel an instinctive closeness. We stare into the flames, and we feel connected to the people sharing that light. That's the ancient bond of the horror movie survivors. As the long hours crawled on, the night had one more psychological weapon in its arsenal: the false dawn. Anyone who has ever been awake through a sleepless night knows the trick the darkness plays. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, a profound despair settles in. The fire feels smaller. The cold is deeper. The hope of sunrise seems like a lie. This was the witching hour for our ancestors, the point at which the body's defenses dipped to their lowest ebb, and the predators knew it. The animals that hunted at this hour had evolved to sense fatigue, and so the sentinels had to be rotated. The group could not afford a single hour of unguarded time. Some researchers now believe that the human sleep cycle itself, with its alternating phases of deep and light sleep, evolved partly as a response to this nightly crisis. A group asleep together naturally has members drifting in and out of lighter stages, creating a spontaneous, organic sentinel system. Even in sleep, the horror movie was being survived by biology acting as a collective. Then, finally, the first hint of the sky changing. Not light, but a subtle dilution of the blackness. A gray seam on the horizon. The birds, always the first to announce the end of the horror show, would stir. A single chirp, then another. The predators, the nocturnal killers, would begin to retreat. They were no longer in their kingdom. The sun was arriving to reclaim the world. And for the exhausted, terror-worn group around the dying fire, that gray seam was the most beautiful sight in the universe. It was not just morning. It was a reprieve. It was the credits rolling on last night's horror movie. The relief was so overwhelming, so profound, that it likely sparked one of the earliest forms of ritual celebration. The sunrise was greeted not just with weary relief, but with sounds of triumph. Voices raised in something that wasn't quite song yet, but was on its way. Bodies moved in clumsy dances of survival joy. The children who had been held in white-knuckled grips were now lifted into the cool, safe air. The terror was gone, and so the day began not with grogginess, but with a fierce, bright gratitude. Gratitude that they were still a family. Gratitude that the fire had held. Gratitude that the horror movie had been survived once again. That daily sunrise celebration is embedded in our psychology. Have you ever wondered why a sunrise feels hopeful? Why we still take pictures of it? Because for millions of mornings, a sunrise didn't just mean new day. It meant you and everyone you loved were still alive. Now, here is the astonishing legacy. That nightly horror movie, that 8-hour gauntlet of fear and fire and solidarity, did not break our ancestors. It built them. It built us. The night turned bipedal, furless primates with no claws and no night vision into the most resilient social species the planet has ever seen. It forced the development of language because you had to communicate fear and reassurance in the dark. It forced the perfection of cooperation because you lived or died as a group. It forced the creation of imagination because you had to populate the darkness with stories in order to make sense of it. The horror movie of the night was the pressure cooker that forged the human soul. Without it, we would not have music, we would not have poetry, we would not have the ability to sit around a table in a warm room tonight and feel a deep, unspoken love for the people beside us. That love is the ghost of the firelight. That comfort is the echo of a sentinel's steady breathing. That sudden moment when you look at your family and feel overwhelmingly lucky. That's the sunrise gratitude still alive in your blood. So tonight, when you close your eyes in a secure room, remember what it cost to earn that safety. Remember the millions of nights when your ancestors sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping their weapons, watching the glowing eyes in the darkness, telling each other stories to hold back the fear. Remember that the most terrifying question in human history was not, will we find food tomorrow, but will we live to see the dawn? And they did. Night after night, they survived the horror movie. They passed their fire-lit genes down to you. The night is no longer a monster to most of us. But on some deep, ancient frequency, your body still knows the old script. It still wakes you at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding, listening for the growl, expecting the title screen of the horror movie to appear. And if you ever find yourself camping, far from city lights, and the darkness presses in like a living thing, don't dismiss the fear. Honor it. It is the voice of your ancestors telling you that you come from a long line of survivors. They faced the real horror movie, armed with nothing but fire, trust, and a story. And they won. So will you.